The Nexus station had what you might charitably call a reputation. Not the good kind, mind you. The kind that made seasoned cargo haulers suddenly develop urgent business 3 sectors away whenever a transport contract came up. The kind that had insurance companies quietly doubling their premiums and muttering about unforeseeable xenobiological incidents in their fine print. Captain Holt Manning knew all this, of course. He also knew that bills didn't pay themselves, and his ship's hyperdrive had developed an alarming tendency to hiccup at inconvenient moments. So when the transport manifest pinged his console with a rush job to the station's outer docking ring, he did what any reasonable human would do. He cursed creatively for 30 seconds, then accepted the contract. What he hadn't expected was to find himself standing in the sterile white corridor of Research Wing Delta, staring at Station Director Keith Valdres through a reinforced viewport that was currently reverberating with the most ungodly sounds this side of a black hole. "Let me get this straight," Holt said, watching something large and furry hurl itself repeatedly against the interior wall. "You want me to babysit?" Keth's 6 arms performed an elaborate gesture that probably translated to exasperation in whatever corner of the galaxy had spawned his species. His elongated head bobbed on its serpentine neck, and when he spoke, his translator unit made him sound like a particularly harried middle manager. "The term we prefer is temporary juvenile supervision specialist." Uh-huh. Another thunderous impact shook the viewport. And these would be the juveniles in question? The Apex Predator Juvenile Study Program represents the pinnacle of interspecies behavioral research, Keth began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who'd given this speech before, usually to very unhappy people. "We house offspring from 3 of the galaxy's most magnificent apex species. Vorthak cubs from the Crimson Nebula, Krillian hatchlings from the Obsidian Worlds, and Nexari pups from the nightmares of every sane being in the galaxy," Holt finished. "Yeah, I've heard of them. What I haven't heard is why you need a cargo hauler to watch them." Keth's primary arms twisted in what might have been embarrassment. Dr. Yenko, our lead xenobiologist, has developed what his medical file describes as acute stress-induced molt syndrome. He's shedding? Profusely. The medical bay looks like a pillow fight broke out. In any case, we need temporary supervision while we arrange for a replacement specialist. Through the viewport, something let out a sound that made Holt's teeth ache. It was answered by 2 other voices, creating a harmony that would have made ancient Earth demons weep with envy. "How temporary are we talking?" Holt asked. 6 to 8 hours. The night cycle." "And the pay?" Keth named a figure that made Holt's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. It was enough to fix his hyperdrive and buy a nice dinner somewhere with actual gravity. "There's got to be a catch," Holt said. "Well," Keth's voice took on a carefully neutral tone, "there have been some behavioral issues." As if summoned by his words, a new sound emerged from beyond the viewport. This one was different, less rage-filled roaring, more frightened whimpering. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something large trying very hard to hide under something that probably wasn't large enough to hide it. "What kind of behavioral issues?" Keth's 4 secondary arms began an intricate dance of nervous fidgeting. The subjects appear to have developed an aversion to their caretakers. Define aversion. They've terrorized 18 different researchers from 12 different species. Dr. Yenko lasted the longest at 4 days, and that was only because he refused to leave his environmental suit. Even our most experienced predator handlers can't get within 50 meters without triggering what our behavioral analysts describe as catastrophic panic responses. Holt watched something small and dark streak past the viewport, followed by what sounded like every piece of furniture in the enclosure being systematically destroyed. So, what makes you think a human cargo hauler is going to do any better? Honestly? Keth's head tilted in a gesture that was probably meant to be sheepish. We're out of options. The Galactic Wildlife Preservation Council is threatening to shut us down if we can't demonstrate adequate juvenile care protocols by tomorrow morning. You're the only sentient being on this station who hasn't already been classified as triggers immediate flight response by our subjects. Lucky me. The whimpering from inside grew louder, joined by what sounded suspiciously like hiccups. Big hiccups. The kind that suggested whatever was making them probably weighed more than Holt's cargo hauler. Look, Keth said, and for the first time, his translator managed to convey something like desperation. I know how this sounds, but we've tried everything. Pheromone therapy, sonic dampeners, even holographic surrogates. Nothing works. They're scared, Captain Manning. And scared apex predator juveniles are, well, they're not good for station morale. As if to emphasize his point, another sound emerged from the enclosure. This one was definitely crying. Not the angry crying of a tantrum, but the heartbroken sobbing of something very young and very frightened. Holt sighed. He'd always been a sucker for kids, even the kind with teeth like industrial cutting lasers. Fine, he said, but I want hazard pay if anything tries to eat me. Done. And if this goes sideways, you're paying for my ship repairs. Agreed. And I want it in writing that this was your idea, not mine. Already prepared. Keth produced a data pad with 2 of his arms while the other 4 continued their nervous dance. Just thumbprint here, here, and here. Holt signed the documents, wondering if this was how his obituary would start. Holt Manning, age 38, was devoured by alien cubs while trying to pay his bills. Excellent! Keth's relief was palpable. Now, there are a few safety protocols we should review before— Skip the speech, Holt said, already moving toward the enclosure's entry port. I've been around scared kids before. How different can it be? Keth made a sound that his translator couldn't quite process. It might have been laughter. It might have been the alien equivalent of famous last words. The entry port hissed open, and Holt stepped into what the research files euphemistically called a naturalistic habitat environment. What it actually looked like was the aftermath of a particularly destructive tornado, if tornadoes came equipped with claws and bad attitudes. Furniture lay scattered and shredded across the floor. Walls bore deep gouges that spoke of very large, very sharp implements of destruction. The air smelled like ozone and something that reminded Holt unpleasantly of wet dog, if wet dogs happened to be the size of small shuttlecraft. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the enclosure. "Anyone home?" The silence stretched for a long moment. Then, from somewhere behind an overturned couch that looked like it had been designed to seat a small giant, came a sound that was part whimper, part growl, and entirely pathetic. "Hey there," Holt said, moving slowly toward the sound. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt anyone." He rounded the couch and stopped dead. 3 pairs of eyes stared back at him from the shadows. They were easily the largest eyes Holt had ever seen on anything that wasn't a cartoon character, and they were filled with the kind of liquid terror that made his heart do uncomfortable things in his chest. The Vorthak cub was the smallest of the 3, though small was relative when discussing a creature that probably weighed as much as a small speeder. Its fur was a deep crimson shot through with black stripes, and its oversized paws suggested it had a lot of growing left to do. The saber teeth that gave its species their fearsome reputation were still kitten-sized, which made them merely terrifying instead of instantly lethal. The Krillian hatchling had wedged itself into a corner with an efficiency that spoke of lots of practice. Its armored carapace was a mottled brown-green that would have provided excellent camouflage in its native environment, but here just made it look like a very large, very frightened beetle. Its compound eyes tracked Holt's movements with mechanical precision. The Nexari pup was trying to hide behind both of its companions, despite being easily the largest of the three. Its psychic abilities were already manifesting as a faint shimmer in the air around its wolf-like head, and its scorpion tail was curled so tightly over its back that Holt wondered if it was cutting off circulation. All three of them were shaking. "Well," Holt said quietly, "you guys look like you've had a rough day." The Vorthak cub's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Not in fear, Holt realized with surprise, but in what looked almost like curiosity. "Yeah, I get it," he continued, settling down cross-legged on the floor a safe distance away. "New place, strange smells, weird aliens poking at you all day. I'd be pretty freaked out, too." The Nexari pup's head tilted slightly, its psychic shimmer fading as its tail uncurled a fraction. "You know what?" Holt reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a protein bar. "I was going to save this for later, but I think you guys need it more than I do." He unwrapped the bar slowly, making sure his movements were visible and non-threatening. The sound of the wrapper crinkling made all three cubs perk up their ears. "It's not much," he admitted, breaking the bar into 3 pieces. "But my grandmother always said that sharing food was the fastest way to make friends." He placed the pieces on the floor between himself and the cubs, then scooted backward to give them space. "There, help yourselves. No strings attached." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the Vorthak cub crept forward, its massive paws silent on the debris-strewn floor. It sniffed delicately at one of the protein bar pieces, then looked up at Holt with those enormous eyes. "Go ahead," Holt encouraged. "It's all yours." The cub picked up the piece in its mouth, and Holt held his breath, waiting for the inevitable rejection. Instead, the little predator's eyes went wide with what looked suspiciously like delight. It chewed thoughtfully, then made a sound that was definitely, unmistakably, a purr. The other 2 cubs perked up immediately. The Krillian hatchling scuttled forward with surprising speed, its mandibles clicking with what Holt was beginning to recognize as excitement. The Nexari pup followed more cautiously, but its tail was now wagging with tentative hope. "That's it," Holt said softly, as all 3 cubs munched on their treats. "See? Not so scary after all." Outside the viewport, he could see Keth Valdris staring in what appeared to be shocked disbelief, all 6 of his arms frozen in mid-gesture. Other research staff had begun to gather, their various alien faces pressed against the reinforced glass like visitors at a zoo. The Vorthak cub finished its piece and looked hopefully at Holt's jacket pocket. "Sorry, buddy," Holt said, patting the empty pocket. "That's all I've got for now. But tell you what, how about we see if we can find you guys some proper dinner?" He stood slowly, and for a moment, all 3 cubs tensed. But when he didn't make any sudden movements or threatening gestures, they began to relax again. "Come on," he said, walking toward what looked like it might once have been a feeding area. "Let's see what kind of gourmet cuisine they've got set up for you." To his amazement, all 3 cubs followed him. Not closely, they maintained a respectful distance, but they followed nonetheless, their earlier terror replaced by cautious curiosity. Behind the viewport, Keth Valdris was frantically gesturing to his staff, his translator unit crackling with barely coherent instructions about documentation and behavioral analysis. Holt ignored the growing audience and focused on his charges. After all, he'd been hired to babysit. And if there was one thing he'd learned from his brief experience with his sister's kids, it was that hungry children were unhappy children, regardless of species. Even if those children happened to be apex predators with a combined potential body count in the thousands. "So," he said conversationally as he examined the feeding dispensers, "anyone want to tell me what you usually eat? And please don't say, 'the previous caretakers.'" By the next morning, word had spread through Nexus Station like a particularly virulent strain of gossip. The human, the unremarkable, cargo-hauling, hyperdrive-fixing human, had not only survived a night with 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous juveniles, he'd apparently become their favorite person in the known universe. Dr. Nova Blake arrived at Research Wing Delta to find a crowd of alien researchers pressed against the observation viewport like kids at a candy store, which, considering the circumstances, was either deeply ironic or mildly horrifying. "Excuse me," she said, elbowing her way through a cluster of Zephyrian graduate students whose crystalline forms chimed disapprovingly at her intrusion. "Official business. Head xenopsychologist coming through." She reached the viewport and immediately understood why everyone was staring. Inside the enclosure, Holt Manning was sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading from what appeared to be a maintenance manual, while 3 apex predator cubs lounged around him like oversized house pets. The Vorthak cub had its enormous head resting on his knee, purring loud enough to rattle the viewport. The Krillian hatchling was curled up against his side, its usually aggressive mandibles clicking in what could only be described as contentment. The Nexari pup had somehow managed to drape itself across his shoulders like the world's most dangerous scarf, its psychic field shimmering with what Nova's instruments would undoubtedly register as pure happiness. "How long has this been going on?" she asked Keth, who was standing nearby with an expression that suggested he'd witnessed either a miracle or the end of civilization as they knew it. "6 hours, Keth replied, his translator unit struggling with what sounded like bewilderment. They haven't left his side since the feeding cycle at 0300. When he tried to step outside for a break, the Nexari pup started what our sensors classified as cosmic-level tantrum." "And our other researchers?" "Dr. Yanko tried to enter the enclosure an hour ago to collect behavioral samples. He made it 3 steps before all. 3 cubs formed what I can only describe as a protective barrier around the human. The Vorthak cub actually hissed at him." "Hissed, Dr. Blake?" "A 600-pound apex predator hissed like an annoyed house cat." Nova pulled out her portable analysis unit and began taking readings. "Pheromone levels?" "Normal. No unusual electromagnetic signatures, no detectable psychic emanations from the human, no anomalous gravitational fields. By every metric we possess, Captain Manning is utterly, completely ordinary." "Then why—" "If I knew that," Kath interrupted, "I wouldn't have called you." Nova studied the scene through the viewport with the critical eye of someone who'd spent the better part of her career trying to understand why alien minds worked the way they did. It was a question that had kept her awake more nights than she cared to count, and right now, she was looking at the biggest puzzle of her professional life. "I want to run some tests," she announced. "What kind of tests?" "The kind that might actually tell us something useful instead of just confirming what we already know." She turned to address the crowd of researchers. "I need volunteers, different species, different approaches to interacting with the cubs. We're going to figure this out scientifically." The first volunteer was Dr. Uthek, a Zephyrian whose crystalline composition made him, theoretically, the least threatening presence possible. Crystals didn't eat other things, after all. They didn't even move very quickly. The results were immediate and catastrophic. The moment Dr. Uthek's harmonic frequency entered the enclosure, all three cubs erupted into panic. The Vorthak cub's purr transformed into a sound that made everyone within a 50-meter radius reach for their emergency ear protection. The Krillian hatchling's carapace clamped shut with an audible snap, and it proceeded to bury itself in the nearest corner, like a living boulder. The Nexari pup's psychic field spiked so dramatically that half the station's sensitive equipment registered interference. Holt, caught in the middle of the chaos, did the only thing he could think of. He started talking. Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice somehow cutting through the noise. "It's just Doctor Uthek. He's not going to hurt anyone. Look, see? He's backing away." And indeed, Dr. Uthek was retreating so rapidly that his crystalline form was creating small sonic booms as he fled toward the exit. "That's right," Holt continued, settling back down among the cubs. "Just a visitor. Nothing to worry about." Gradually, the panic subsided. The cubs resumed their protective formation around their human, and the enclosure returned to its previous state of improbable domestic tranquility. "Well," Nova muttered, making notes on her data pad, "that was enlightening." The next volunteer was biomechanist Juno Hayes, whose cybernetic enhancements made her, in theory, a hybrid between organic and artificial intelligence. Surely that would make a difference. It did not. Juno made it exactly 4 steps into the enclosure, before the Nexari pup decided she represented some sort of existential threat, and proceeded to demonstrate why its species was classified as a Class A galactic hazard. The psychic blast sent Juno staggering backward into a wall, where she remained for several minutes, staring at nothing while her neural implants recalibrated. "I saw colors that don't exist," she reported later, "and they were all angry at me." The Krillian hatchling, not to be outdone, emerged from its defensive posture and began what could only be described as an interpretive dance of territorial aggression. Its mandibles clicked in patterns that roughly translated to "go away" or "become a organic paste," while its armored legs drummed against the floor in a rhythm that made everyone's teeth ache. The Vorthak cub contributed by opening its mouth and demonstrating that even juvenile saber teeth were perfectly capable of leaving deep grooves in reinforced metal flooring. Through it all, Holt remained perfectly calm, sitting in the eye of the storm like it was just another Tuesday. Okay, he said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I think that's enough visitors for now. How about we find you guys something to do that doesn't involve terrifying the nice researchers?" The cubs immediately settled down, though they maintained suspicious glares at the viewport where an increasingly large crowd of observers had gathered. "This is unprecedented," Nova murmured, her fingers flying over her analysis equipment. "The behavioral differential is off the charts." "Translation?" Keth asked. "They're acting like completely different animals when he's around. It's not just the absence of fear, it's the presence of something else. Comfort, trust, affection, even." She paused, studying the readouts with growing excitement. "I need to try something," she announced. "What if the variable isn't the human himself, but his approach, his behavioral patterns? Meaning maybe we can teach other species to interact with them the way he does." It was a reasonable theory. It was also, as they discovered over the next few hours, completely wrong. The Zephyrian volunteer who tried to mimic Holt's calm, seated posture lasted 38 seconds before his harmonic frequency sent the cubs into full defensive mode. The morphoid researcher who attempted to replicate his soothing tone of voice achieved the remarkable feat of making sounds that apparently translated as threats in 3 different apex predator languages simultaneously. Even Keth himself, when he tried to approach with the same non-threatening body language Holt used, succeeded only in triggering what the behavioral analysis computers described as maximum predator evasion protocols. By the end of the day, they'd tried 18 different approaches with representatives from 12 different species. The results were universally disastrous, with the notable exception of one aquatic overlord who managed to get within 20 meters before the cub's panic reached emergency levels. "This doesn't make sense," Nova muttered, reviewing the day's data for the 15th time. "We've controlled for every variable we can think of. Approach angle, vocal patterns, movement speed, electromagnetic signature, pheromone emissions, even quantum field fluctuations. There's nothing special about the human that our instruments can detect." "Maybe that's the point," Keth suggested. "What do you mean?" "Maybe the absence of something is what matters, not the presence of something else." Nova looked up from her datapad. "Go on." "Every species we've tested has some evolutionary specialization. Zephyrians are living crystal matrices. Morphoids are shapeshifters. Aquatic overlords are telepathic. My people are optimized for multidimensional problem-solving. Even humans have their thing. They're persistent omnivores with unusual pattern recognition capabilities. And maybe that's what the cubs are responding to. Not what humans are, but what they're not." Before Nova could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the research wing. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in pulsing red, and the station's automated voice began delivering the kind of announcement that made experienced spacers reach for their emergency equipment. "Attention all personnel," the voice intoned with synthetic calm. "Multiple unscheduled arrivals detected in the outer system. Classification: apex predator, adult, hostile intent probable. All non-essential personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Through the viewport, they watched Holt look up from the story he'd been reading to the cubs, something about Earth animals called puppies that had apparently captured their complete attention. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing the sudden tension in the cubs' postures. All 3 young predators had gone rigid, their senses apparently picking up something that the station's sensors were only just beginning to detect. "Oh," Keth said quietly, his 6 arms beginning their familiar dance of impending panic. "That would be the parents." The cubs' heads snapped toward the viewport, their eyes wide with what looked like a mixture of excitement and terror. In the distance, the first of the incoming ships appeared on the station's external displays. It was the size of a small moon, covered in what appeared to be organic armor plating, and it was moving toward Nexus Station with the kind of purposeful intent that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "How bad?" Nova asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Well," Keth replied, watching 2 more ships decloak in the distance, "the good news is that they're probably not here to destroy the station. And the bad news? They're here to collect their offspring, and they're going to want to know why their children have been in what they undoubtedly perceive as constant terror for the past 2 weeks." Through the viewport, they watched Holt continue reading his story, apparently oblivious to the approaching apocalypse. The cubs had pressed closer to him, seeking comfort in the only presence that made sense in their young lives. "You know," Nova said thoughtfully, "this might actually be the perfect opportunity to test our theories." "How so?" "If we're right about humans being somehow neutral in the galactic ecosystem, then maybe, just maybe, those parents won't see Captain Manning as a threat. And if we're wrong, then we're all about to become very small, very distributed particles floating in the vacuum of space. The first ship was now close enough that they could make out individual details of its construction. It looked less like a spacecraft and more like a living creature that had decided to take up residence in the void between stars. "Well," Keth said, his translator unit crackling with nervous energy, "I suppose we're about to find out just how special humans really are. The thing about facing down 3 of the galaxy's most terrifying apex predators while they're in full parental rage mode is that it really puts your life choices into perspective." Holt Manning was having that exact moment of clarity as he watched the external displays show ships the size of small cities closing in on Nexus Station. "Attention, Captain Manning!" Keth's voice crackled through the enclosure's comm system, barely audible over the growing cacophony of emergency alarms. "We're initiating emergency evacuation protocols. Please proceed to the nearest escape pod immediately." Holt looked down at the 3 cubs pressed against him. The Vorthak was trembling so hard, its purr had become a continuous vibration that rattled his bones. The Krillian hatchling had clamped its carapace shut so tightly he could hear the armor plates grinding against each other. The Nexari pup's psychic field was fluctuating wildly, creating visible distortions in the air that made his eyes water. "Yeah, that's not happening," he said into the comm. "Captain, please be reasonable. Those are adult Vorthaks, Krillians, and Nexari approaching the station. They're each capable of disintegrating a small fleet, and right now they think their children are in mortal danger. Then maybe someone should tell them their kids are fine." There was a long pause. When Keth's voice came back, it carried the tone of someone who was rapidly running out of options and sanity in equal measure. "Captain Manning, with all due respect, that's a suicide mission. No known species has ever successfully negotiated with enraged apex predator parents. The mortality rate for such encounters is, well, it's 100%. "First time for everything," Holt replied, gently stroking the Vorthak cub's massive head. "Besides, look at them. They're not dangerous right now. They're scared kids who want their parents." Through the viewport, he could see the research wing rapidly emptying as alien scientists fled toward the evacuation zones. Only Nova remained, her fingers flying over her portable analysis equipment with the desperate intensity of someone trying to solve a cosmic puzzle before the universe ended. "Dr. Blake," Holt called out, "what's your professional opinion here? Are these cubs going to be happy to see Mom and Dad? Or are we looking at a family reunion that ends with property damage?" Nova looked up from her instruments, her face flushed with the excitement of discovery. "That's just it. The cubs aren't exhibiting standard pre-reunification behaviors. They should be displaying excitement, territorial marking, preparation for hierarchical reintegration. Instead, they're showing classic attachment anxiety patterns." Translation for those of us who don't speak xenopsychology? They're scared their parents are going to take them away from you. The first ship had now reached the station's outer defensive perimeter, which promptly shut down rather than risk provoking an incident that would result in everyone becoming component atoms. The vessel was even more impressive up close, a biological nightmare of organic curves and what appeared to be living armor that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. "How long until they reach the docking bays?" Holt asked. "At current approach velocity?" Keth's voice had taken on the brittle quality of someone whose stress levels had exceeded his species' recommended maximums. 18 minutes, maybe 20 if they stop to examine our defensive systems before deciding whether to disable them or just fly through them. Plenty of time." Holt stood up slowly, careful not to disturb the cubs more than necessary. I'm going to need a few things. Such as? First, I want you to open a direct communication channel to the incoming ships. Second, I need someone to bring me the cubs' feeding schedule, medical records, and any documentation of their care while they've been here. Captain, I don't think you understand the magnitude of— And third, Holt continued, I need everyone to stop panicking long enough to think about this logically. These are parents coming to check on their kids. Yes, they're terrifying death machines capable of cracking planets, but they're also just parents who've been worried sick about their children. The station shuddered as the second ship took up position on the opposite side of the docking ring. Through the observation ports, Holt could see movement within the bioship's translucent sections, things shifting and flowing with predatory grace. Communication channel established, Nova announced, her voice tight with tension. Though I should mention that our universal translators are having trouble with their linguistic patterns. Apex predator communication tends to rely heavily on subsonic threats and biochemical markers that don't translate well. Just do your best. The view screen flickered to life, and suddenly, Holt was looking at something that made every survival instinct his species had ever developed start screaming at him to run. The adult Vorthak filled the screen, a creature of impossible size and lethality, with saber teeth that could have served as ship's hull breaches and eyes that burned with the cold fire of a born killer. When it spoke, the translator unit produced sounds that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate in his bones. Station entities. Our offspring location. Immediate surrender or consumption. Well, Holt muttered, they're certainly direct. He stepped closer to the view screen, very aware that he was now the focus of attention from something that could probably bite his ship in half. Behind him, the cubs had gone completely silent. The kind of silence that spoke of prey animals trying very hard not to be noticed. "Hello," he said, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "My name is Holt Manning. I've been taking care of your children while their regular caretaker was ill. They're safe, healthy, and right here with me." The adult Vorthak's massive head tilted slightly, and Holt had the unsettling sensation of being evaluated by an intelligence vast, alien, and utterly unmoved by anything resembling human concern for personal safety. Human entity. Explain offspring distress signals. Explain terror emanations detected across multiple cycles. That's a fair question. Holt glanced back at the cubs, who were now creeping forward with the cautious hope of children who desperately wanted to see their parents, but weren't sure they deserved to. "Your kids have been scared because the research staff here didn't understand how to interact with them properly. They were treating them like scientific specimens instead of children." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. The Vorthak's eyes narrowed to slits that promised extremely creative forms of violence. Research staff location. Immediate identification for consumption purposes. "Now hold on," Holt said, stepping between the view screen and the cubs. "That's not necessary. Nobody hurt them. They were just incompetent. Your kids are fine. Look." He gestured for the cubs to come forward. After a moment of hesitation, they did, clustering around him like living proof that apex predators could indeed look sheepish. The adult Vorthak's expression changed instantly. The promise of violence faded, replaced by something that Holt recognized from every parent he'd ever known. Relief so profound, it was almost painful to witness. Offspring. Status report. The Vorthak cub stepped forward and made a series of sounds that were part purr, part chirp, and entirely adorable. The translator unit struggled for a moment before producing safe warm fed, human friend protector, other beings scary wrong smell, Human friend, good safe stories. Stories? The adult Vorthak's attention returned to Holt with laser intensity. Human entity provided narrative. Entertainment? Well, yes. They seemed to enjoy hearing about Earth animals. Puppies were a big hit. For a long moment, the universe held its breath. The adult Vorthak studied Holt with the kind of attention usually reserved for things that were about to become lunch. Then, impossibly, its expression shifted into what might have been approval. Human entity demonstrated proper offspring care protocols. Acceptable temporary guardian status acknowledged. The view screen split, revealing the other two adult predators, each one a masterpiece of evolutionary lethality. The Krillian looked like a living siege engine, crossed with a particularly aggressive mountain range. The Nexari resembled what would happen if a wolf decided to become a cosmic horror and succeeded beyond its wildest dreams. All three were now studying Holt with the kind of attention that civilizations usually received just before being classified as extinct. Human entity, the Nexari spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that made reality seem slightly less stable. Offspring displays unprecedented attachment behavior. Explanation required. Holt felt something click into place in his mind, a realization that had been building since his first moment with the cubs. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because I'm not trying to be anything other than what I am. Your children can sense that I'm not a predator, not prey, not a parasite. I'm just neutral, safe. I don't trigger their evolutionary warning systems because humans don't really fit into the standard categories." The three adult predators exchanged glances that contained volumes of communication Holt couldn't begin to interpret. "Neutral entity?" the Krillian rumbled, its voice like continental drift with anger management issues. "Concept requires evaluation." "Offspring retrieval postponed," the Vorthak announced. "Further investigation necessary." And then, in a move that would have made galactic historians weep with joy if they'd been present to witness it, all three apex predators settled into what could only be described as listening positions. "Human entity will explain neutrality concept," the Nexari commanded. "Detailed analysis required." Holt looked back at Nova, who was staring at her instruments with an expression of scientific ecstasy. "Well," he said, settling back down among the cubs, "I guess we're having that conversation after all." Explaining the concept of evolutionary neutrality to three apex predators who could collectively redesign local space-time was not exactly covered in Holt's cargo hauler training manual. But then again, neither was babysitting alien cubs, and he'd managed that just fine. "All right," he said, settling more comfortably among the cubs while their parents loomed on the view screen like living nightmares with parental concerns. "Let me tell you about humans." The adult Vorthak's massive head tilted in what might have been curiosity, or the prelude to creative dismemberment. "Proceed. Neutral entity." "Every species I've encountered in this galaxy has a specific role in the universal food chain," Holt began, unconsciously stroking the Vorthak cub's head. "Zephyrians are living crystal matrices that feed on electromagnetic radiation. Morphoids are shapeshifters who consume genetic material. Aquatic overlords are telepathic apex predators in their oceanic environments. Even Keth's people are optimized for multi-dimensional resource extraction." He paused, noticing that Nova had moved closer to the viewport, her recording equipment working overtime to capture what was undoubtedly the most important xenobiological conversation in galactic history. "But humans," Holt continued, "we're omnivores who evolved on a world where we weren't the biggest, strongest, fastest, or most specialized at anything. We survived by being adaptable generalists. We don't fit neatly into predator, prey, or parasite categories because we can be all three depending on the situation. The Krillion's mandibles clicked in a pattern that the translator identified as interested confusion. Clarification required. Human entity claims multiple ecological classifications. Not claims. Demonstrates, Nova interrupted, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who'd just solved the greatest puzzle of her career. Captain Manning is absolutely right. Humans are the only known species that doesn't trigger specific evolutionary responses because they don't represent a clear threat or opportunity category. She activated her analysis equipment, projecting readings into the air between the cubs and their parents. "Look at these biostress indicators from the past 3 weeks," she said, her voice gaining momentum as scientific excitement took over. Every other species that approached the cubs triggered specific biochemical responses. Zephyrians registered as energy vampires. Morphoids showed up as genetic threats. Even my cybernetic enhancements flagged me as unclear biological classification. Avoid until categorized. The Nexari's psychic field shimmered with what Holt was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of raised eyebrows. And human entity registers as? Nothing, Nova said triumphantly. Completely neutral. Their evolutionary warning systems don't even notice him unless he makes a specific effort to be noticed. The 3 adult predators exchanged another series of glances that contained enough unspoken communication to fill several diplomatic treaties. "Neutral entity status confirmed," the Vorthak announced after a moment. "Offspring attachment behavior now comprehensible. Human entity represents unprecedented safe category." "More than that," Holt said, as understanding dawned. "Your kids aren't just comfortable with me because I'm safe. They're comfortable because I'm the only adult they've encountered who doesn't automatically trigger their assess threat level programming. They can just be kids around me." The Krillian made a sound that might have been thoughtful rumbling, or possibly the noise a small planet makes when contemplating its own geological instability. Implications: substantial. Neutral entity status suggests possible galactic mediation capabilities. "What do you mean?" Holt asked, though something in the back of his mind was already putting the pieces together. "Galactic conflict origins," the Nexari explained, its psychic field pulsing with colors that made Holt's eyes water. "Species interactions complicated by evolutionary response patterns. Predator species automatically assume dominance positions. Prey species engage defensive protocols. Resource competition inevitable." "But if there was a neutral species," Nova breathed, her scientific mind racing ahead to the implications, "one that didn't trigger anyone's hardwired responses." "Mediation potential significant," the Vorthak confirmed. "Neutral entity could facilitate interspecies communication without triggering competitive responses." Holt looked down at the 3 cubs, who had arranged themselves around him like living proof of concept. The Vorthak cub was purring again. The Krillian hatchling had finally relaxed enough to extend its sensory antennae, and the Nexari pup's psychic field had settled into patterns that Nova's equipment was registering as contentment and trust. "You know," he said slowly, "this explains a lot about why humans have been relatively successful at establishing trade relationships with so many different species. We're not threatening enough to trigger defensive responses, but not weak enough to be dismissed entirely." "Proposal," the Krillian announced, its massive form shifting in what might have been the alien equivalent of leaning forward with interest. Neutral entity employment as interspecies, juvenile specialist, compensation substantial. You want to hire me as a babysitter? Holt asked. For the galaxy? Neutral entity demonstrates exceptional offspring care capabilities, the Vorthak confirmed. Multiple species would benefit from neutral juvenile supervision services. Think about it, Nova added, her eyes bright with excitement. Diplomatic families, trade negotiations involving multiple species, even scientific research programs like this one. A neutral mediator who doesn't trigger evolutionary responses could revolutionize interspecies relations. Holt looked around the enclosure, at the three cubs who had transformed from terrified apex predators into affectionate alien children under his care, at Nova, whose scientific breakthrough was written all over her face, at the view screen where three of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures were waiting for his answer with what appeared to be parental approval. 6 months ago, his biggest concern had been fixing his hyperdrive and making enough credits to keep flying. Now he was apparently being offered a career as the galaxy's first interspecies juvenile specialist and diplomatic mediator. "Well," he said finally, "I guess I'm going to need a bigger ship." The adult predators made sounds that the translator interpreted as satisfaction, approval, and what might have been laughter. The cubs responded by pressing even closer to him, secure in the knowledge that their favorite human wasn't going anywhere. "Arrangements will be made," the Vorthak announced. "Neutral entity vessel, upgrade authorized. Compensation package includes full diplomatic immunity and universal translation capabilities. Plus," Nova added with a grin, "you'll be making history. First human to establish a new category of interspecies relations." Holt Manning, former cargo hauler, current apex predator babysitter, and future galactic mediator, looked down at the three cubs who had started this whole adventure by being afraid of everyone except him. "You know what?" he said, scratching behind the Vorthak cub's ears while it purred loud enough to rattle the viewport. "I think I can live with that." 3 months later, when Captain Holt Manning's new ship, a converted diplomatic vessel equipped with specialized juvenile care facilities, departed Nexus Station with its first official passengers, half the galaxy's conflict resolution requests were already waiting in his message queue. And in the cargo bay that had been converted into the most expensive playground in known space, a small menagerie of young aliens from 18 different species played happily under the watchful eye of the only adult in the universe who didn't scare them. It turned out that sometimes the most important discovery wasn't what made you special. It was what made you ordinary.